You're watching a tiny boat explode in the middle of the ocean. The Pentagon says drug trafficking vessel neutralized. Another win for America. But here are three facts they'll never tell you in the same breath. 1. The U.S. has spent over $1 trillion fighting drugs since the 1970s. Yet drugs in America are now cheaper, purer, and more available than ever. 2. The drug routes being patrolled, they're the exact same shipping lanes that carry the oil keeping the global economy and the U.S. dollar alive. 3. The countries whose waters these boats pass through, the same ones hit hardest by U.S. sanctions and regime change operations. When you see that missile hit a boat on your screen, you're not watching a drug raid. You're watching an empire defending its power. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how this works, where it's heading, and what happens if nothing changes. Stay with me.
Part 1. The surface story. Let's start with what they want you to see. The official story goes like this. U.S. forces detect a suspected drug trafficking vessel. They track it, issue warnings. The boat doesn't comply. They fire. Later, a statement. We disrupted narcotics that would have harmed American communities. Sounds clean. Sounds justified. And look, I'm not going to lie to you. Drug trafficking is real. Cartels are violent. The people doing these operations are putting their lives on the line. But here's what that simple story leaves out. Everything that actually matters. Because this isn't just one mission. It's a tiny piece of a system that's been running for over 50 years. And to understand why missiles are hitting boats today, you need to understand what that war has really accomplished and what it's quietly allowed.
Part 2. The War on Drugs, a Spectacular Failure. President Nixon officially declares the war on drugs. Since then, hundreds of billions spent. By many estimates, over $1 trillion. On interdiction, on policing, on military operations. So, did it work? Let's look at the data. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and U.S. government reports, global drug production hasn't vanished. It's adapted. Cocaine and heroin routes shifted when pressure increased. Synthetic drugs exploded. New substances keep appearing. Meanwhile, in the United States, overdose deaths hit record highs in recent years. Street prices for many drugs, adjusted for inflation, have dropped. Purity has increased. Read that again. After 50 years of war, drugs are more available and more deadly. Yet the budgets keep flowing. The deployments continue. The surveillance expands. So if this war has failed on its own terms, why does it continue exactly the same way? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Because the war on drugs isn't just about drugs. Part 3. The real game. Oil, shipping, and power. Pull up a map. Look at the typical drug boat routes. Caribbean Sea, Eastern Pacific. Now look closer. What else do you see? These are the same waters where oil tankers travel from major producers, commercial shipping moves between continents, and U.S. and allied navies run freedom of navigation patrols. Let me give you a concrete example. Venezuela. Venezuela has some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. For years, it's been under heavy U.S. sanctions, political pressure, economic isolation. Now, U.S. operations near Venezuela are officially framed as counter-narcotics missions. And yes, smugglers do operate there. But strategically, there's a second benefit. These missions give the U.S. a normalized military presence in waters that matter for monitoring oil flows, enforcing sanctions, tracking commercial shipping, gathering intelligence on rival states. You don't need conspiracy theories to see this. This is just how great powers operate. They find legal and moral justifications to maintain forces in regions that matter to their economic interests. The drug threat makes that presence easy to sell to voters and justify under international law. So that single boat explosion, it's part of a much bigger picture, one that connects crime, oil, and empire. And at the heart of that empire sits not just aircraft carriers, but a currency.
Part 4. The Petrodollar System. Let's talk about the US dollar. Since the mid-20th century, the dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency. That means central banks hold dollars, international trade happens in dollars, oil gets bought and sold in dollars. In the 1970s, after the US left the gold standard, something crucial happened. The US struck a deal with major oil producers, especially in the Middle East. Oil would be priced and sold primarily in dollars. This petrodollar system did two powerful things. One, it kept global demand for dollars high. Every country that needed oil also needed dollars. Two, it allowed the US to borrow and spend far more than other nations. Foreign countries bought US government debt, recycling their dollar earnings back into the American financial system. In practical terms, the US could run massive deficits, fund wars, maintain global military bases, while its currency stayed strong. But there's a catch. To keep this privilege, two things must remain true. The world must believe the U.S. is the safest place to park savings, and the U.S. must be able to enforce the rules of global trade and finance. This is where sanctions and drug wars meet. When the U.S. labels a country as a narco regime or rogue state, it follows up with financial sanctions, restrictions on dollar access, attempts to block oil exports. To enforce these measures, you need to monitor sea lanes, patrol shipping routes, gather intelligence on who's buying and selling what. Counter-narcotics operations provide ongoing cover for exactly this. When a small boat gets destroyed, it sends multiple messages. To cartels, we're watching. To local governments, we can operate here. To rival powers, we control these lanes. To the world, the U.S. enforces this system. But here's the question. How long can this model last?
Part 5. The system is cracking. Even before recent strikes, the dollar-centered system has been changing. China and Russia are pushing to trade in their own currencies. Regional blocs are discussing alternatives. Sanctioned states, Iran, Venezuela, others, are experimenting with barter, gold, cryptocurrencies, non-dollar deals. So far, none have fully replaced the dollar. The U.S. still has enormous advantages. But every time the U.S. uses force and punitive measures to defend its position, sanctions, gunships, strikes, it sends a signal. If you depend on our system, we can cut you off. Step out of line, you become a target. Short term, very effective. Long term, it creates incentive for countries to build alternatives where U.S. pressure is weaker. Think about it from their perspective. Today, it's a drug boat. Tomorrow, it's their oil tanker. Next year, it's their bank. They will invest in parallel systems. The dollar won't collapse overnight, but if the U.S. keeps overusing these tools, its position as the trusted center can slowly erode. And history shows, once that trust is lost, it's nearly impossible to get back. Part 6.
What happens if nothing changes? Let's play this out. If the default response stays the same, send ships, claim a war, fire missiles at boats, several things will happen. First, the drug problem won't improve. We have 50 years of proof. Routes shift, producers adapt, new substances emerge. Meanwhile, the root causes, demand, addiction, economic despair, remain untouched. Second, these regions will stay unstable. Every intervention risks civilian casualties, political backlash, strengthening of extremist groups who point to foreign aggression. That instability creates more migration, more black markets, more crime. Third, the U.S. drifts into classic late-stage empire behavior, relying on force over diplomacy, expanding surveillance and exception-based laws, spending trillions on distant missions while infrastructure crumbles at home. Citizens watch money pour into wars on things while basic needs go unmet. Social trust erodes. Fourth, the world fractures into competing blocs. As countries insulate themselves from U.S. pressure, you get fragmentation. And fragmented systems make crises, energy shocks, banking panics, regional wars, more likely. Bottom line, the U.S. may win tactical victories, boats destroyed, headlines generated, while losing the strategic war, the war to remain a trusted, stable center of the global system.
Part 7. The Alternative Path. But there is another way. Imagine if the resources spent on militarized drug interdiction were rebalanced. At home, treat addiction as public health, not crime. Reduce demand through education, treatment, opportunity. Target big money laundering, not small boats. Abroad, work with regional partners on development, not just enforcement. Use sanctions selectively with clear goals and time limits. Prioritize transparent diplomacy over covert pressure. Invest in resilient, shared infrastructure. None of this is easy. It doesn't fit in a 30-second news clip. It won't produce viral explosion footage. But strategically, it may be the only way to avoid the fate of past empires that tried to hold on with ever more force.
Closing. So, next time you see a headline, U.S. forces strike drug boat, remember, you're not looking at a crime story. You're looking at a crossroads. Path 1. Keep repeating the pattern. A forever war on drugs that doesn't solve drugs. Growing military and financial pressure. Slow erosion of trust in the system you're trying to defend. Path 2. The harder path. Treat drugs as a complex social problem. Use military power sparingly with clear limits. Defend the dollar not just with ships and sanctions, but with real stability and value. Which path we take will shape not just some distant coastline, but the global economy and the lives of ordinary Americans. The stories that shape your future are rarely told in full on the evening news, but that's why you're here. If you want to understand these hidden connections between headlines and systems, between war, money, and empire, hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning.